Laser rhinoplasty is, in my opinion, safer than filler rhinoplasty, and let me explain why. First of all, we're going to need some props. So I have here the fiber optic cable that we attach to the endo laser, and I use for laser facelifts, laser rhinoplasty, blepharoplasties, neck, body treatments. This is an amazing piece of equipment, and I am very grateful for the manufacturers for developing it and for its safety profile. We're going to need a syringe. I'll show you in a second, and pencil. So let's start with a pencil. So everyone's heard that a filler, especially in areas like the nose, the glabella, possibly the tear trough, but essentially any filler anywhere on the face can cause blindness. Not only can it cause blindness, but it can cause stroke, and it can also cause death. Now, let me reassure everyone, the risk of a serious complication with filler, when it's done to a high standard with somebody who understands the anatomy, is somewhere in the region of 1 in 100,000 to 1 in 800,000. It is incredibly rare. So keep those figures in mind, bearing in mind the millions and millions of filler treatments that are done. Right, let's talk anatomy. So we have a biting muscle here called the masseter. In front of the masseter, your facial artery extends into the face, wiggles around, comes to the angle of the mouth about 1 centimeter, and then splits into your inferior labial artery, and then travels up. You get a branch of the superior labial artery, and it continues in the nasolabial fold up to the side of the nose, and attaches and has communication with lots of vessels in this area. It has a branch that comes up and over on the nose, and another branch that comes a little bit higher up. That communicates there. Now you also, about 1 centimeter or so below the orbital rim, you have an artery that comes out here. It's called the infraorbital artery, and that has communications. It supplies parts of the face, but it has a communication with the facial artery. Now, the important thing is that the infraorbital artery also has a communication inside the orbit that goes into the orbit deep, and it attaches to your central retinal artery. Your central retinal artery is what gives your eyeball, and in particular the retina, its blood supply. Important things to know about why filler can cause blindness and why laser rhinoplasty is highly unlikely to do that. I've had some communication from some of my colleagues to say that they're concerned that laser rhinoplasty can cause blindness, but there's a fundamental misunderstanding as to the mechanism for that, not only in the anatomy but also in the physiology. So I'm going to try and explain it for them and for people in general. So with filler, you have a gel inside a machine. The machine is a syringe. Now the machine is operated by applying pressure to the plunger, which forces the gel out. Sounds basic. It is basic, but it's really, really important. Now, it might be that there are some blood vessels a bit closer to the center part of the nose. We try and inject down the middle, but let's say there's a bit of an anatomical variation because the nose has got tons of connections, mostly at the tip, but they crisscross. These are called anastomoses, and it means that the blood supply from one side of the face communicates with the blood supply from the other side of the face, and there are loads of these scattered throughout, but the nose in particular, is a high-risk area for filler complications. Now, if you inject filler accidentally into one of these blood vessels, what can happen is your pressure that you apply with your fingers to inject the gel is higher than the blood pressure in the artery. Imagine that the blood is flowing, let's say, towards the center. Imagine that for ease. Now, what can happen is as you inject, because the injection pressure is higher than your blood pressure, the gel can actually travel backwards to your infraorbital artery and keep traveling backwards into your orbit and your central retinal artery and block the central retinal artery, which is very, very narrow at certain points. That is obviously a devastating complication, but it requires a substance which is inside the blood vessel, which is thicker than the thinnest part of its path. So imagine that you have a boulder traveling down a canyon, and the canyon is getting narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower to a point where the boulder can no longer fit through. That's where it gets blocked. And this is called, it's called a retrograde flow. So it's going backwards. Now, why doesn't this happen with a laser rhinoplasty? Because a laser rhinoplasty works in the superficial layers of the skin. Even if it penetrates a blood vessel, it isn't injecting a substance that can get blocked. Now, there is, in theory, a potential for causing something called a thrombosis. That's where your blood clots and it coagulates. But there's no pressure involved in using a laser. So you are unlikely to get, even if you were to get a blood clot in one of the small arteries, the chance of that blood clot passing retrograde against the normal flow of blood, which is in the opposite direction, is very, very small. So the risk of blindness with this, for all my colleagues who have questioned it, and for the general public, it's not a logical assumption. Doesn't work. So physiologically, it's not correct.